behind. When all the world seems in tune, and love goes on softly on. So don't be sighing or crying, dear, if winter comes.
Lawyers, Guns and Money broadcast. I'm Scott Kaufman, SEK. This is Steve Attewell, as we've been for the past couple of weeks, as the entirety of the Lawyers, Guns and Money broadcast, because if something is wrong with everyone else. And, of course, there's now a leaf blower going on behind me. I apologize for this. I know the most interesting way to begin a podcast is with a leaf blower, but okay, I think we're good to go now. All right, so... See, I'll let you. I'll let you
okay.
Start. Where do you want to begin?
So I mean, continuing with our sort of ongoing discussions of torture and identity, I thought it'd be interesting to sort of parallel the experience of Jaime and Theon, in that, on the one hand we have Jaime, who really gets put through the ringer very, very quickly. That opening scene of his is very uncomfortable in the way that he is, physically humiliated. He's clearly, in bad medical shape. He's being denied access to water. He's being,
American soldiers can drink their own urine. If it's good enough for Americans, it should be good enough for...
Well, I think it's more, it's the loss of physical dignity.
Yeah.
All physical dignity,
Plus it's someone else's urine, so...
And it's not a human being's urine.
Yeah.
Which, kind of adds insult to injury. And, in a way, I think we can sort of see the last gasp of Jaime's old identity when he goes for the sword and discovers within a few seconds that he is no longer that person. And he says that to Brienne afterwards, where he says, "I was that sword hand."
And now he has to become his offhand.
The interesting thing... Yeah, and the interesting thing is that, Brienne at that moment kind of offers him a new identity. Says, the world is tough. You've, finally been exposed to something outside of your privileged background. Grow up, and live for revenge, which is an ongoing theme this week. Whereas, by contrast, Theon's whole kind of... torture and journey and then return to torture is about revealing his personality, where he gets the chance to monologue about his identity as a Greyjoy versus a Stark, kind of aided and abetted by this figure who is drawing out his life story in order so that he can not just destroy his body, but destroy hope itself. And this was the moment where we really see, I think we can just call it now, this is Ramsay Bolton, and he's out to destroy hope.
Yeah.
It's like, amateurs torture people's body. Ramsay likes to torture souls. And that, he's just engineered this incredibly dramatic experience just to get Theon to open up to him so that he can torture him more effectively. And you kind of saw him sussing things out that, first he asks about his sort of self-image and how much did the being sent to the Starks affect him, and then he brought up, he plants the seed that his father knows about him being tortured and has allowed that, and, previously he brought up his sister, so he's sort of seeing where this guy's heartstrings, are located. And then, my God, that look on his face, I mean, if you have a still of this, please do insert it, where, he's...
I'll do it in post.
Yeah, where he's smiling at, Theon's look of total despair is like, okay, they have perfectly cast this guy.
No, they really haven't. I mean, that's the look. I mean, that's the look on, and I'm blanking on his name. It's very Welsh.
Ewan. Rion? Ricky?
Yeah, I think. Yeah.
All right. Apologies to the Welsh, but
yeah. Thank you, Welsh, for your lack or surfeit of nouns, nouns, vowels or consonants. Yeah, he's perfectly cast in this role. I think one thing about that we should talk about with both Theon and Jaime is, and about sort of the way the series is going generally, is we've been led to believe that the series is going to be strung out, that we're going to take our time through these books, and it seems to me that in the past 2 weeks we've had evidence of the exact opposite. Jaime and Theon are both already sympathetic characters, which took a hell of a lot longer in the books.
Well, I mean, it depends on who you talk to. You know, I sort of follow the fandom response quite a bit, and at the moment it seems fairly evenly split to me. That, you know, there are some people who right now really, you know, feel sorry. You know, their empathy is a little bit more developed. They feel very sorry for Jaime and Theon. And there's other people who are still like, no, Jaime tossed a kid out of a window. Theon had 2 children murdered. They have not yet earned their redemption. So, you know, I think it may be an ongoing process.
Well, I guess here's what I'll say, and I'll put on my my visual rhetoric hat and say that screen time matters. I mean, I know those events happened, and I think the people responding to them know that Jaime did do that, and Theon, you know, has confessed to killing 2 orphans. I mean, but we don't see that happen repeatedly in the way that we see Jaime's hand hung around his neck in close-up throughout the first part of the episode.
It's
purely a matter of screen
falling
time.
from the tree again, but it's not.
Yeah,
it's kind of a little bit more vague of an illusion.
And he's almost flying. I mean, that isn't a. He's not terrified, and he climbs up the tree himself and meets his mother up a tree. But
then she tosses him off the tree.
And it's her, not.
Yeah,
not
that
Jaime.
was weird.
And I think it's important because if you're going to build up sympathy for Jaime, and this is really a matter of simply of the number of shots per scene, and I talked about this in one of my earlier Game of Thrones posts, the episode whose name is escaping me, but that opened with Tywin and Jaime over the Baratheon stag.
Oh, that would be episode, I believe, 208?
Yeah.
No, sorry, 108.
108, and it's the first time we ever see Tywin.
Yeah.
And in that scene, the number of shots of each of them per scene, it's so tilted to Tywin that we see Jaime for literally half the number of shots as we do Tywin. And in what I described in that post was in a way of creating the air of who's more important in this scene. Simply the number of times you're on screen versus the characters that you're reversing to is actually really important in terms of the viewer's perception of how significant you are as a character. Similarly, yes, we know Jaime, you know, kicked Bran out of a window. We know what Theon did to those orphans. But now we're just getting screen time with Jaime and with Theon. And the sympathy is building in part because we have the knowledge that they did horrible things, but we're currently seeing them being tortured.
Yeah.
And it's just the repetition. In the same way that, you know, I've talked about before, how one of the ways that the showrunners for Doctor Who create a relationship between the Doctor and the companion is to just use a lot of 2-shots. Because if you use a 2-shot, you have the 2 characters on screen at the same time. If you do that all the time, the viewer is going to naturally associate them and think that these 2 people are related.
I mean, the thing I find curious is I know, you know, for those who are not yet convinced about Jaime, I know what story beats and you know, they're going to use to transform Jaime into a character who is more unambiguously sympathetic. I'm not so sure with Theon. I mean, I know roughly where this is going. It's more a question of pacing that I'm curious about, in terms of.
I don't think
you know, when he can.
I think they're really pushing very hard to make, and as you said, you know, to make Ramsay Bolton not just a torture of body, but of mind.
Yeah.
And our sympathies are sort of naturally going to go to the victim of that. And I know that speaks poorly of Americans generally, since there are real people who've been tortured that we haven't given a shit about. But, in terms of, a television show, we're on Theon's side, absolutely 100%. I don't think it's even... I don't think it's going to be arguable by the time that Bolton is done doing what he's going to do to Theon.
I'm not disagreeing with that. I'm just curious about the timing of when Bolton is going to be done, because the stages of what Bolton's up to.
It should take a couple of years.
Yeah, that's what I was thinking. Is how are they going to keep sort of... I read a few people, not many, but a few people complaining about they felt that there was a certain circularity to Theon's plot. I mean, literally, he goes back to where he started. But, I think there's interesting places that they can go. What I'm curious about is how they manufacture a kind of coherent arc season by season until Theon's plot begins to intersect with other plots that are going to be happening, in which he can... I'm trying to avoid spoilers really hard.
Yeah, no.
But you've read the book, so you know what I'm referring to.
And I think most of the people listening to this probably have read the book, so they know what we're talking about. But on the off chance that you don't know what we're talking about, I will put out there that I'm becoming more and more convinced that George Martin is actually rewriting the books. That he is not... That as he storyboards the series, he is going back and correcting what he thinks after the fact were mistakes. And we all do this, every time, we go back to something we've written, like, Jesus Christ, my dissertation, right? I mean, the first page. I would not wish that upon anyone. And yet I gave it to at that time, the three most important people in my life. So I would just say that I think he's going back, and this notion of condensing all these narratives and accelerating them has to have some sort of payoff. I mean, I think Theon is just going to become more of what he's going to become much more quickly, because otherwise it's going to be this weird. It's almost going to be like too
much
on a soap opera who's just quirky for years. Right?
Yeah, they can't... It's funny you bring that up, because that just gave me a thought, right? Remember, George's major kind of writing issue that he's had to deal with is this 5-year gap that he intended to interpolate, and then realized that he couldn't, and then, I think a lot of people's problems with A Feast for Crows / A Dance for Dragons is that he was, working himself out of this problem. But, for the TV show, I mean, the irony is the aging of the child actors especially may kind of do that naturally. They are literally aging a year for every season, so that by the time we get to the, knock on wood, the 5th and 6th seasons...
I think they have contracts for well past that, though, so...
Yeah, I just meant that, the transformation in what it's going to look like to see, Arya in the later, in a couple seasons, or Sansa in a couple seasons, is just gonna work naturally in a way that it, you can see the strains in the books.
Yeah.
So moving on, I mean, I want to take a little bit more of a political bent for just a second, because I thought it was very interesting this episode, the way in which Varys makes a big play in this episode. One which I think we can reveal, it's not this kind of machination on his part does not happen in the books. It makes sense. It's in character and in keeping, and fits with the overall plot. But it is kind of interesting that, it is very characteristic of his style, which is that as a spider, he hangs back and then strikes at once. And we see that with the reveal of the sorcerer in the box, which I loved. That was a new introduction, but it sort of shows you, he bides for time, continuing this theme of revenge. He bides his time, and then he moves decisively. And then we see that again when he approaches the Tyrells, that, he's been kind of fencing with Littlefinger for a couple years now. First when both of them were in the small council in Robert's administration, and then when, Tyrion is Hand of the King, and now he's making a very bold move to try and offset his, Littlefinger's growing power. I thought there was a nice parallel.
I agree. There's, there are a couple things about that. One, I think it's really important that it was Tyrion he was making that reveal to.
Yeah.
Because he wasn't just informing Tyrion that, look, I have my issues too. I'm sorting them out. He was actually indicating that I seem to be someone who's only involved in back corridors, as we saw in the first season when Arya spies him. He was actually indicating that he is, and it's a corny phrase, but that he's a man of action.
Or a eunuch of action.
Because he hasn't done anything yet doesn't mean he's incapable of action. And he wants Tyrion to know that.
Yeah. And he's also providing Tyrion with the model of action himself.
Exactly, yeah.
This is, in some ways a kind of a pedagogical moment.
Reading my mind, dude. Yeah, that's exactly where I was going. Because he then tries to do the same thing with the Tyrells, and he is himself schooled. And it's sort of a nice scene because he's acting in the same exact mode as he was with Tyrion. And given that we've already associated the Tyrells with Tyrion, the old white lady version of Tyrion.
They haven't met yet, which is going to be Tyrion and the Tyrells have not interacted at all, and it'd be very interesting to see what happens when they do.
I think the other thing I should say that was interesting, and I only noticed this when I was rewatching the episodes consecutively, because one of the things that I mentioned to you in an email was that I think if we consider these first 4 episodes as a single episode, it really works. I mean, structurally, in terms of the pacing, it really fits together well. But rewatching it, what's odd about this season is how the name of Stark has become a token. And so we have
a famous name, yeah.
Well, we have Theon, for instance. For the first time, at least this season, the name Ned Stark is said, and from everyone who it could have come from, it's from Theon.
And Olenna also brought it up several times.
Yeah, but the name itself is starting to become a kind of currency.
Yeah, and I think that's important. One thing, I'll give the showrunners credit. They're very good at sort of setting up things in dialogue one season that serve to provide a foundation for the next season. So, in the first season, you'll notice Stannis is mentioned repeatedly.
Yep.
So that people who are following the show by the end of the first season were like, "Who the hell is this guy Stannis?" And then when we finally see him, people have something to kind of hang their hat on. And I think they're doing the same thing with Ned for reasons that, if we're going to do a spoiler section, we can explain there. But,
Everybody, Ned is a dragon. No, okay.
Yeah. The interesting thing is, Olenna kind of really puts Varys on the back foot, that he's been used to sort of hanging back and being, just making illusions and so forth. And Olenna's kind of signature strategy of, I'm going to be old and inappropriate and talk at you fast, and you're going to stumble over yourself because you're not used to dealing with that, works. But what it gets her to is that, Varys kind of has to finally come out and say what he thinks. And he says, Littlefinger is the most dangerous man in Westeros. He would burn the kingdom down just so that he could be king of the ashes. And just as a side note, I'll say the writing in this episode has taken a massive step up. I kept on, when I was writing my notes, I kept on writing down quotes because there's like, oh, that's a really good phrase. There's a little bit in Theon's monologue where, talking about Robb, he says his life fit him better than his clothes, which I thought was just like, oh, that's brilliant. But the interesting thing is, so Olenna makes Varys meet her as an equal, and he lays his position out there. And, they kind of come to an understanding that geostrategically you can't allow someone like Sansa Stark, who is in herself, a good-looking girl who doesn't know what she's doing, to be captured by someone like Littlefinger. And then Olenna kind of takes a decisive action herself to both protect Sansa, but also to, further the interests of House Tyrell, which is kind of the way that the Tyrells do politics. And there's a phrase that I'm actually writing an essay for an ebook about Game of Thrones called Machiavellianism for a Purpose, and I think that's really appropriate for the Tyrells because they're very manipulative, but in a constructive fashion. That, they look to build alliances, and, in this case, Olenna has many ways that she could deal with this Sansa Littlefinger situation, and she chooses a way that will benefit her family, but also benefit Sansa, and, doesn't involve killing anybody. And we see an interesting sort of parallel with that in the scene with Joffrey and Marjorie and Olenna and Cersei, in that Marjorie is dealing with a psychopath of a king, whose idea of a good first date is to, chuckle gleefully at the thought of, mothers being devoured alive in front of their sons and similar atrocities, and decides, I'm going to teach this kid how to wave to the people, and does a very kind of interesting Lady Di bank shot where the crowd is chanting Marjorie, and she gets them to chant, Marjorie and Joffrey. And that terrifies Cersei.
Well, it's because it becomes clear at that point that, and they say as much in the episode, that it's all about how we can manipulate Joffrey. That's the game at this point. And Cersei realizes that she can't offer Joffrey the kind of adulation that he desires, without betraying her father. And I think, again, thinking about this episode as a 4-episode arc, with Cersei aligning with Tywin, via musical chairs in the previous episode, that's sort of what prevents her from acting here, because she realizes now she has to play the long con. She can't just be concerned with Joffrey's interest at a particular moment.
Yeah, although there's an interesting thing, which is that Olenna jams her on gender issues in the Sept of Baelor. She kind of says, isn't it ridiculous that, the men have all the power and the women don't, and, we're trying to save our sons from killing themselves. And Cersei immediately kind of then goes and challenges her father.
Yeah.
And gets brutally shut down. It's an interesting parallel with Tyrion again, that, here is another Lannister child asking for acceptance, only to get smacked down for being unworthy of the Lannister legacy.
But in terms of the blocking, there's a big difference between Tyrion sitting opposite head of the table from a table whose head it's difficult to tell, and Cersei being basically like every student who's ever in our office hours on the other side of a desk while we're doing something more important than whatever the fuck she's talking about.
Tywin has clearly read whatever management book says, if you invite someone to a meeting, make sure that you're doing something during the meeting to demonstrate how more important you are.
I think it's How to Be a Wealthy Asshole. I think that's But the other thing I'll say about when you're talking about how the dialogue seemed to improve, and there seemed to be a lot of very kind of punchy dialogue. We'll just put it like that in this episode. Is that I really think that, and we were getting punchlines to jokes that have been being set up for 3 episodes.
Yeah,
that's certainly the case, and we'll get to Dany in a moment, but that's certainly the case with her.
Oh yeah,
we have the big reveal, and it's a great big reveal because the reveal is I understood you, and it's a non-reveal, but with everyone else everyone finally figured out with the past 3 episodes what they had been doing, and I think the writers clearly planned it that way, and knew people would be sort of disgruntled with the first couple of episodes and upset.
Yeah.
But also knew not so upset that they would stop watching,
and that the payoff would be that much more intense. Yeah. No, I mean, you were talking about a lot of people have been sort of comparing this episode to like a season finale. And it does seem to me, I know that they don't do it this way, but you know how The Walking Dead has those sort of mid-season finales and then season finales, that, they really did something interesting here where they clearly, these first 4 episodes form a mini-arc within the season that gives it a nice kind of, ba-bump moment, kind of, rising and falling action, and then rising and falling action. And I like that. So moving on, I did want to talk about the sort of the interesting contrast between the Brotherhood without banners and the Night's Watch. And, here we finally get exposed to what the Brotherhood without banners means. And this is, probably my favorite institution in the world of Westeros. And it's interesting because it's a military institution that is created in the wake of a complete defeat. That, Beric Dondarrion and Thoros of Myr and, Stark's men and Baratheon men are sent out for a kind of a normal military exercise. There is an outlaw, bring him to justice in the name of the king. And they get ambushed by the king's father-in-law and, destroyed and totally scattered. And by the time that they regroup, they've now become the rebels and outlaws. And they kind of have to make a choice of what do you do now? The king is dead. The new king thinks that you're a rebel. Law and order have been turned upside down. People who massacre the countryside are now doing so on the orders of the crown. And what they do is they create this new cause. They say, we are going to defend the small folk of Westeros from anyone who threatens them. And it is, in its own way, as kind of a revolutionary institution. And you can see that in Beric Dondarrion, that, before all of this happened to him, especially in the books, we really don't get this in the show. In the books, he's a very conventional kind of medieval figure before this whole ambush. That, he's a handsome knight, he's married to a woman, a beautiful woman from a wealthy family, he's got a castle, he's about to go fight an attorney, he gets this important job from the hand of the king, his life's going well, and then all of a sudden, all of that comes to a crashing stop. And he kind of sets himself up as now in opposition to all of the institutions of the past. I mean, one thing that we didn't get told is that, all of these swineherds and stonemasons and tailors and tilers have all been knighted by Beric Dondarrion. And he's kind of making this kind of revolutionary statement that, the social order has broken down and that we are going to create this counter-institution in the name of this new religion, the reveal of which we're going to get next episode. But I really found it interesting.
I thought we got the... Okay, go on. Sorry.
Well,
I thought we did get the reveal this episode.
Yeah, I mean, they said, we've been reborn in the Lord, in service of the Lord of Light, because if you've seen what we've seen, you would too.
Yeah.
And they're putting off showing us what they've seen.
Oh, okay.
But, these men have been, literally born again in a religious sense. And I'm going to be very interested to see what they're going to do with, Relorism / the religion of the Lord of Light in the rest of this season, because we've already had one model of how to worship the Lord of Light that has been kind of unambiguously portrayed as villainous. You know, Melisandre has been described by George R. R. Martin as his most misunderstood character. But in the show, she's been very clearly portrayed as a kind of a villainous figure.
Until the last episode, where they had lots of tender, medium close-ups of her and Stannis. That actually, when I was watching, I almost wondered if they had replaced her with a different actress, because her face was so less severe than it had been in previous scenes. And I'm sure that's just their way of communicating that she's manipulating Stannis. But it was very strange. I think you're right, though, that basically what they're doing here is they're portraying in a strangely religious way sort of the French Resistance.
Yeah.
Right. A bunch of people
down to the Revolutionary Tribunals of Justice. Yeah.
Right. It's a what would you do if the Nazis just invaded you, swept through in a week, and you were left to and our feelings about terrorism in sort of contemporary America are pretty stupid, because our experience of terrorism is solely from the perspective of people being attacked.
Well, with the exception of the Wolverines,
Jesus Christ, yes. Let's not even mention you mentioned, but it's really, terrorism is sort of unambiguously a bad thing. Whereas if we think about the French Resistance, no, it's okay. There were Nazis. That justifies any sort of... And we're getting a very similar thing here, or a very similar dynamic in terms of how are we supposed to feel about these guys, given that they're going to fight whoever wins. And we're not necessarily opposed to some people winning.
Yeah.
Right? And they aren't either, but they're... At this point, oh god, I am so in spoiler country. It's almost painful. They're not. I'm just gonna shut up, actually, because I can't. Okay. I cannot finish that sentence without ruining. Like,
the main thing is that it's kind of an interesting kind of turning on its head of the kind of the logic of heroism and villainy that we've seen in the show to date, which is we think of the Starks as the good guys. We think of the Lannisters as the bad guys, and then here comes this third group that says they're basically the same. That Robb may be a nice person, but at the end of the day, he is a lord, and his cause is, a lord's cause. And unlike in a modern war where there has to be some element of public buy-in to a cause. Here, this is a straightforward family issue. He's going to war because they killed his father, and the rest of the North has to follow him because they've sworn oaths to.
Well, there is the tension there, because what Robb was talking about with his future wife when he was relaying what Ned had said about what makes for a good lord, and given the fact that our first image of Ned is of him doing a duty of a good lord that is a dreadful thing, beheading Will.
Yeah.
And then himself being beheaded. And Robb talking about sort of a feudal model as a family model, which probably,
paternalistic.
It's a fantasy that it would be more like Leave It to Beaver than it would an actual feudal society. Take care of everyone.
It's the ideal of noblesse oblige.
Yeah.
And what we're gonna see, and what we have already seen, is that there's limits to how far you can impose in a feudal society on your bannermen, on the people who follow you. That at the end of the day, the political system is still one of personal relationships. and that those aren't guaranteed in the same way that we think of a constitution as being, set in, in writing.
This is actually a really good point to transition to that other group you wanted to talk about.
Yes, the Night's Watch, where their social contract is breaking down. Yeah, that we can see their solidarity splintering around them. That they're starving. The wounded can't get enough food. They're being worked like dogs for the little food that they do get. And Mormont tries to kind of appeal to the sense of tradition with the funeral. And it doesn't quite work. And you get the sense that he's tired, that, he can't remember where this guy came from. And he can get them to follow him in one chorus. But, Rast, for all that he's a traitor and a rather horrible human being, kind of makes a point that, he says, when the White Walkers come, Craster will serve us up like so many pigs. And the problem is that Mormont doesn't come up with a solution to the problem of Craster, who is openly flaunting his allegiance to their enemy, who, is really, throwing it in their face that, he's happy to kill their wounded comrades, that he'll feed them, as little as he can, and
or
that he
to the pigs.
Or to the pigs, and that, he can't stop himself from antagonizing them. And so, the problem is that Mormont, doesn't have a solution, so the best he can do is to go down fighting in the name of another social institution, which I just want to kind of highlight for people who haven't read the books, the concept of guest right. That when you're under someone's roof and you've taken their food, they're not supposed to harm you, and you're not supposed to harm them.
Yes, footnote to listeners, read the Iliad, the Odyssey, the Bible, basically all works of classical literature.
And I really thought this scene was blocked and shot amazingly well in the sense of the instant chaos that ensues the moment that Mormont gets stabbed in the back, and you can see it's very unclear who's fighting whom.
It's a prison riot, and it's shot like it's shot like prison riots are conventionally shot, and I'd sort of worked that up in terms of how you film people in a confined space, and it creates tension simply by our sort of natural kind of claustrophobia, and how we sort of like how Das Boot works, right? I mean, you can't watch Das Boot without just feeling like, like all of the windows are closed. It could be a bright sunny day, 90 degrees. You feel like it's 40 degrees and you're shuttered in a hole somewhere. And this had the same feel, and it was shot the same way. And the chaos was a direct result of, I'm forgetting the name of the Italian New Wave director who came up with this. But, oh God, and I can't even remember the name of the phrase in English or Italian. I'm terrible today. But of placing the camera in a scene of confusion and moving it in inhuman ways as a way to disorient us by making us feel as if we have some sort of first-person perspective, but we actually don't. We're being moved around, jumped around the room, and it creates not just a chaotic-looking scene, but a scene that actually messes with our, depending on who you ask, 6th or 7th sense, perception, right? Yeah. Our sense of our body and
where things are, because you don't really get a sense of where people are fighting and who's fighting who exactly. I did like the moment where, the kind of the traditional action beat would be, for George to succeed in strangling his assassin to death. That would be his badass moment, and that he doesn't quite pull it off, I think, is a nice bit of realism. That in Westeros, the bad are not always punished as they should be. And, I think we can admire the fact that Mormont has the strength to almost succeed. But the reality is that he doesn't.
And on that note, let's shift to Dany.
Complete unreality, yeah.
Let us go to the moment that we all have been waiting for, that has been building up now for 3 episodes, but very much so at the end of the last episode.
Mm-hmm.
As many of you YouTube commenters noted on our last podcast, but which weren't actually posted because I don't have comments turned on. Feel free, though. I still read your feedback. I just don't let all of the angry people post. But it was really... this was Dany's moment, and she started smiling last episode, and it just continued straight through here. And I was reading some other people, and I should keep a list of links so I can cite them directly, but I'm lazy. But I was reading other people talk about this in terms of classical Aristotelian drama, that this was, this was the moment of revelation, right? This was the moment of realization, and I think that's true to an extent. I mean, if we really want to kind of talk about anagoresis and if we want to do that, in perpetua, I mean, we could do that, but I think it's wrong-headed because Dany knew all along. It's not as if she suddenly realized that she spoke High Valyrian. It's not as if
it's reversed. It's all happened in our heads. It just didn't actually happen out there.
Yeah, it's this. I mean, and
more like those shows about like con men. What was it? There's one called like Heist and one called, the bit where they show you a scene.
Yeah.
And completely flummox you, and then go back and show you what's really happened. That
leverage, I think is the
leverage exactly, yeah. And it's like that's what's happened. It's that Dany has just pulled off a huge con on the city of Astapor, and had been planning this more or less since the first scene in Astapor.
Unbeknownst to her advisors, which is important because part of the dramatic irony is that, we take pleasure in knowing more than those assholes. So, there's that. Part of it is a con thing, but I think part of it is just in terms of building up kind of sympathy for Dany, who has been so ineffectual for a good season and a half now. She's done nothing right. And
the showrunners actually, in a bunch of interviews, made very direct links between the season 1 finale and this episode.
Well, and rightly so. I mean,
it's almost as if they're unwriting that second season.
Except, and spoilers if you don't know, this is much like at the end of the first season creates a season of ineffectual Dany. This great moment is the beginning of a very long period of stultification for...
we're not there yet. There's a bunch more action moments that we're going to get to, and I think your statement about George R. R. Martin rewriting as he goes may play very heavily in, because they can't afford to have Dany in essentially stasis for the better part of 2 seasons. Yeah.
It's a great reveal. In part because it's one that we knew was coming, and there's the old Freudian theory that the reason that you think jokes are funny is because you understand them a split second before you get them, and that makes you feel smart. That beat right before you get, before you understand the joke, when you get it, you take that millisecond and you go, damn, I'm smart, I figured that out, and then you laugh.
Yeah.
I mean, that's sort of how this scene played out. But it also, it reminded me of, why it was emotionally effective in terms of, it makes us feel great because we are sympathetically.
It's next to next to killing Nazis, killing slave owners is kind of the most, sympathetic, the most easy villain to target.
I have a great idea. We should make a movie about a former slave who goes and kills a bunch of slave owners.
Yeah, we'll call it Reinhold.
I love that idea. This is it's a really it's the second cheapest feel-good moment, especially for white Americans who take credit for freeing slaves. You're welcome, black people. We are happy to have been of service. It's really cheap, and it only works because of how it's played. Because it is a vulnerable young woman. There's a very similar moment.
Who's revenging herself not just against the slave master, but this leering, crude asshole of a slave master who,
And is also proving herself to one of the knights who, failed father, to, another Mormon. We'll ignore that for a while. But, yeah, it's a coming-of-age moment. It's really nice, but
it's also one of those, big speech moments that you get in a lot of both fantasy, but also kind of in general kind of action war movies. And what I thought was it kind of worked a little bit more than some of them because, often you get, and this is why I can't stand the movie 300, is you get this kind of shoehorning of, American discourse on, freedom and democracy and what we're fighting for.
Well, that's exactly what Frank Miller wanted to do, to use us into thinking we're Spartans. But
I think it's more on point here because she is quite literally freeing slaves.
Yeah, but it's basically a St. Crispin's Day, just sort of taped onto an abolitionist, John Brown type narrative, and it's complete with horrific violence.
But those things actually happened. If Ulysses S. Grant hadn't been, basically battling with depression and social anxiety his whole life, he might have given that speech, in the Red River Valley of Mississippi when, he's, bringing hundreds of thousands of slaves and handing them guns and telling them we're going to destroy slavery.
Yeah, but this is, and this is one of the, as we were talking about the shows getting, this is a moment where we've had sort of a political drama, but as the dragons start to take part in it, we are veering into odd metaphors of atomic weaponry, and we're actually we're getting into a sort of, on the one hand, unrealistic territory, but on the other, quite realistic in terms of how kind of discourse and détente work, or don't if you're from Astapor. But it's a great moment. It's a very, though, it's how do I put this? There are moments, and they're typically associated with comic books. So it's the moment where, someone points a gun at Clark Kent, and he has a choice. He's like, do I take off my glasses?
Right.
Or feign getting shot? And everyone knows what he's going to do. He's going to take off his fucking glasses, open his shirt up, because we all know we like our superheroes to strip in public. But he's going to, what's going to happen. And it's just, it's very satisfying. It's, we are part of this. We are helping her. We have been there with Dany since the beginning and walking naked out of fire. And we have been there, and she is going to free the slaves, and we're right there with her.
And it's also
awesome.
Also, much more than that one scene at the end of season 2, it's much more a moment where we really see this is why dragons matter. Why they really, really matter is that, one thing that, kind of did strike me is that in any action beat, it's only been Drogon so far. Who really does die. He is the dragon we've seen the most.
Yeah.
Um, yeah, but we really see this is why dragons matter. This is why an entire empire was founded on the basis of two empires, on the basis of dragon control. And it's touched off a kind of an interesting debate online. I mean, we saw the bit with Matt Yglesias and Crooked Timber about, is there a market for dragons? And a whole, going with the political parallels about, is this kind of imperialism at work? And all I'll say is, if you haven't read the books, read the books. If you have read the books, go back and read them again, just so that you're grounded in the culture as it stands, as much as the culture that we live through, and that George R. R. Martin kind of lived through. In that there's things going. There's a reason that these Astapori slave masters, who are normally a pretty cunning bunch, kind of throw reason out the window when it comes to a dragon. And there are
essentially North Korea. I mean,
yeah.
You want to give us nuclear weaponry? Okay. We have no conventional weapons. Although obviously the Astapori do. They have armies that they can trade, but they're so eager for an end game, or a successful end game, that they're willing to accept, a deal that they probably in retrospect should not have.
Yeah. But it's going to be very interesting to see, see how the audience handles kind of what we could call Dany the Conqueror, and then, Dany dealing with the question of Reconstruction.
I'm actually very interested in seeing how the audience deals with the flux. I mean, we're fine with nudity, we're fine with violence, but there are some things on screen that, in terms of visuals, that that I think are one thing that I don't think we're actually comfortable seeing. And it's odd because I was watching a documentary last night about the AIDS crisis in the 80s, and it was really telling how few victims of the early HIV. They kept on putting up a picture of Rock Hudson being thin, instead of actually showing someone with sarcomas or with. And so I actually am interested in how the show will deal. A show that is sort of known for its graphic content, how they're going to handle disease, and that, again, that's not really a spoiler. There's disease in
the world,
If you think there wasn't, I'm sorry if that spoiled anything for you. It shouldn't have.
Okay, is there anything else we want to bring up? I'm kind of at the end of my list. Okay,
well, I mean, the moments on that I wanted to talk about, we've sort of covered. I wanted to talk somewhat about Arya's sudden mouthiness, the fact that she seems to have rediscovered her voice, and she seemed to have lost it when she was trying to acclimate herself to Tywin. And since that didn't happen in the books, it's sort of hard to tell how to read that in the series. But she seemed to have become more introspective and introverted as a way to kind of come to understand the society she's trying to infiltrate.
Right.
And that was right up until the last episode. That seemed to be what she wanted to do. And all of a sudden we're back to the old Arya, who is just yelling shit at people. Because,
I mean, I think it's more that she had to be in camouflage, and that at the same time she was kind of in this enemy mine situation where she knew that she was supposed to hate Tywin, but she liked being in the presence. Yeah, and she liked being in the presence of an approving father figure, given that she just lost hers. And it is funny that Arya seems to be the only child that Tywin really likes. But this is a big moment for her, both in the show and the books, in that, like Theon, she's coming full circle. She's come back to where she was in, episode 2 of season 1, and is facing off against the first, the first person on her list of names that she's come in contact with after her 3 wishes didn't quite work out the way she wanted it to. And I think we're going to see a very interesting performance next episode from Maisie Williams, who is always fantastic.
You think? Well, every time you say "you think," I have an odd feeling you mean you know. But yeah, I really thought that was interesting, and the other thing I thought that was at least visually interesting about that is normally when you have a character having a big moment, as with Dany in this episode, the camera moves progressively closer to her, and we've seen this as a pattern throughout, especially with Dany. That we're going to go from a long shot to a medium long to a medium close up to a close up. They didn't do that with Arya. It's a long shot, and she is complaining, and it's a way, I think, to make her look more as if she belongs. That she's not an individual speaking these things, but that she's part of
a court. Yeah.
And I think, and especially in light of what we were talking about earlier, I think they are trying to make her seem as if she belongs to this group. The only other thing I wanted to sort of note, because people in forums have complained about me talking about Dany as a slaver, is that the moment she gives up slavery, she commits wanton murder. Like, in terms of her character, in order to free the slaves, she doesn't even bother to torture him. She doesn't Mirandize him. She just sets him on fire. And the punishment is she is judge, jury, and executioner. And that the reason that we're not annoyed is because it's a function of our sympathy, with her. But
at the same time, she's a sovereign. She's making a statement. She's not just, a person who owns dragons. She is, at this moment, to the extent that a monarch is someone who has an army, she is at this moment a monarch, and she's kind of, executing a surprise attack on an enemy, on enemy leadership. I don't know. I see this as less judicial and more military.
I see that. It's just as if Abe Lincoln set Jefferson Davis on fire. I mean, we would just think, no, that's actually not probably the best way to have handled that. There might be other means. Those were the two main scenes.
Yeah, I mean, it'll be interesting to see how they handle her later dilemmas about, whether it's better to be feared than loved.
Because it's going to be interesting precisely because of the fact that because of the way she's shot and the way she looks, because of course attractive white women are always going to be necessarily sympathetic. Just ask Nancy Grace. Her whole career is built on the fact that we have natural sympathies for white women, especially attractive ones.
And blonde.
And and how are we going to deal with her once she starts making decisions? Is she going to just end up becoming, at least in terms of the audience, our tyrant? Like, yes, she can do whatever she wants to whomever she wants, but we like her. Which oddly strikes me as reminiscent of the Bush years, at least from a conservative perspective. He's that's our Bush.
Well, people thought Lincoln was a tyrant too.
Well, obvious. I mean,
it's the question of how clean or dirty does a revolution get? And that this is there was a debate on as part of the debate online about is Dany an imperialist? one of the things that I did find, kind of, that I'm going to find interesting is how they portray the reaction of slaves to Dany. Is it going to be as complex as it is? Yeah, the freed slaves. But also, word is going to get out about this. This is a revolutionary event in the history of Essos. And word is going to get out to the other slave cities and to the other slaves that there is this figure out here with dragons who wants to free slaves. In the books, the slaves have a very complex set of reaction, and different slaves act in different ways. Here we get one moment of a collective choice that these slaves indicate, or former slaves indicate by banging their spears on the ground, that they've made a choice to follow Dany as free men.
Or they saw everyone else banging their stick on the ground. And
there was a whole lot of conversation about, like, okay, how many of the 8,000 could hear Dany?
Yeah.
And
I mean, there has to be a way that spreads as a sort of panic through the crowd, and especially among military people who are trained to do as their compatriots do.
Yeah,
whether or not the people in the back.
That's the whole thing about the Unsullied, is that they've been systematically removed of individuality, and that they act as a group. It's described in detail in the books that they don't sell Unsullied in groups of less than 100 because they stop acting like Unsullied. They need to be in these masses.
Should this be where we point out the relationship between the Unsullied and Varys? I mean, should we note we have this contrast in this episode between the totally subservient Unsullied and the master manipulator? I mean, it's almost as if the eunuchs are rising.
It's the rise of the eunuchs. I mean, to be fair, in addition to being mutilated, the Unsullied are also given this kind of potion that basically diminishes their ability to feel things like pain. So it's, I don't know how Varys would handle, essentially being doped up to the gills.
But I think the interesting comparison is because he isn't. Yeah. What he's done and how his lack of sex, right, in terms of organs, how that has actually made him more cold, more uncompromising, and a more effective negotiator.
Yes.
Of these, and contrasting that to that those 8,000, Unsullied could in another light be seen as 8,000 potential
Varys's.
Yeah, and that's interesting. The other thing I would like to point out with how the show is moving versus the novels. In the novels, it's still very clear that Dany is interested first and foremost in her kingdom, or what she believes to be her kingdom. We're losing that in the show. I mean, we really are. That we're losing the idea that she is still, playing the Game of Thrones. Because the power of the abolitionist narrative is such that she's going to seem to be acting out of an altruism that we don't. It's certainly not in the books.
Yeah, and that's going to be tricky. They're going to have to work hard to keep her story tied in with Westeros, and to keep her, looking west, or at least people around her looking west. But I think they're gonna. I think they can pull that off.
Well, I guess we will wrap this up because we are nearing in on our time limit for YouTube.
Okay, cool.
YouTube. But we will see you next week.